Thanks, Claudia. Yes, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Susanne Burns, and it's lovely to be here on a Friday afternoon with the wind blowing a hoolie outside my window in the northeast of England. We're being threatened with 60-mile-an-hour gales by 4 o'clock this afternoon, so it's battening down the hatches time. Yeah, pretty wild, pretty crazy. So my name's Susanne Burns. I'm an independent consultant. I'm wearing a purple sweatshirt. I have a pink headband around my brown greying hair, and I'm wearing glasses, and I have a Mr. Scruff poster behind me. I'm in my mid-60s, and it's lovely to see you all here. This afternoon's session on evaluating complex projects is premised on the work that I've been doing for the last couple of years, evaluating the Co-Creating Change Network. And when Sarah was putting together the content of the festival with Tom, we were talking about how to present on evaluation. And we decided, rather than talking about what we've learned so far about co-creation, we would talk about the process, which might be more useful for participants in terms of just thinking about new skills, thinking about different approaches. It's been an incredibly complex project to work on, and I've learned a lot from doing it and applied that in a range of different ways with other projects I've been working on. So it felt like the right approach to take, to have a session that just looked at what we've learned about evaluating complex projects and trying to pass on some of those tools to those of you who are present. It would be really nice if those of you that are here could post in the conversation, just in the chat, just who you are, where you're coming from, and what your experience of evaluation is, because that would be helpful, I guess, when we come to Q&A and discussion at the end, because I'm going to present a series of PowerPoint slides, which I'll share with you, and then we'll just open it up for a conversation. And I'm saying conversation, the platform doesn't really allow conversations as such, but you can post questions or you can post comments in the chat, and we can share those and have some kind of conversation. Hi, Gemma, nice to see you here. Gemma Wolfenden, new theatre director, Leeds Playhouse. That's great. Welcome. So with no further ado, I think I'll just go straight into my slides if I can manage to get them up, and hopefully I'll be able to share these on the screen. So let's have a look. There we go. So hopefully everybody can see that on the left-hand side of their screen. Evaluating complex projects. So it's a little bit slow. Like I said, 2 years ago, I was appointed by Liz. Hi, Liz, Director of Creativity and Social Change at BAC. Lovely to see you here. 2 years ago, I was appointed to carry out the evaluation of the Co-Creating Change Network, which, as you are all aware, I'm sure, was originally a 3-year programme led by BAC, funded by the Arts Council, PHF, ESME and Gulbenkian. And at the point of being appointed to carry out the evaluation, the network contained more than 100 partners. So you can imagine that with the plans for a massive series of diverse projects and activities, ranging from commissions to network events to things like this festival at the end, core group meetings, regional networks, there was a massive range of activity that was being planned as part of the network, and a huge plethora of partners, some of which were large organisations and some were individual artists. So it was hugely diverse. And the challenge in looking at how you evaluate something like that was to try to create some kind of focus, some kind of clarity in terms of what we were trying to find out. There was no point setting out to evaluate every single project by every single partner, or even every single project that was run by the network. It just wasn't going to be possible to do that. So we decided to focus on learning and inquiry questions. We decided to try to be really clear right from the onset what it was that we wanted to learn. And we wanted to develop a series of very light touch evaluation, self-evaluation tools that would be implemented by the people who received the grants for the commissions or the regional network groups that were planning events, but to create something which was very light touch and which involved self-evaluation at activity level, rather than it requiring an external evaluator to attend events and carry something out from an external perspective. That just simply was not going to be possible given the breadth of the activity. So it's been quite a passive role, and actually it's quite interesting, because if we'd gone down a very different path, it would have proved almost impossible in the context of lockdown and all of the restrictions that we faced with COVID. So the approach that we took actually has allowed us to continue to garner learning and to pull all of those, all of the kind of the highlight learning together over the period of the lockdowns and the period of COVID and hybrid provision, and all of the implications that COVID have brought to the breadth of activity that the network's been engaging with, including this week, a series of online events, some live events, and actually even those live events were hybrid with people attending digitally. So it's been massively complex in so many different ways and in so many different levels. So we tried to build up an evaluation approach from the project, if you like, the micro level, to the program, the macro level. What were we going to be able to do in terms of learning from the ground upwards, if you like, and then extrapolating it at a macro level? And so that led us to 3 basic inquiry questions right from the beginning. And as you can see, when we look at these questions, these are not the normal kind of project-based evaluation questions that you might be asking. We weren't saying what worked necessarily, or what didn't work so well. We were actually asking, what is co-creation? And by definition or implication, what isn't co-creation? Can we come out of this evaluation process and this project, the work on the network, can we come out of it with a much clearer definition of what we mean as a sector, and therefore what we don't mean and what isn't co-created? And then linked to that and following on from it directly, the second question had to be around what makes for effective co-creation. What are the kind of the conditions, the qualities, the circumstances, the contexts that might make for effective co-creation? In other words, what works? What is it that we do that actually makes co-creation effective? And flowing again from that, the third question, what kind of outcomes does co-creation generate? And are those outcomes any different to other forms of participatory work? And notice we weren't asking, are they better or are they worse? We were asking, are they different? Let's try and understand the difference between different types of participation. So those 3 questions underpinned right from the beginning the approach that we took to evaluating the network. So whether we were looking at the 11 original commissions that were allocated in 3 batches in the first sort of 18 months of the programme, whether we were looking at the regional network groups, or whether we were looking at the growth and replication commissions, or indeed this week, these questions have been the ones that we've been seeking to answer. So, for example, sitting in on the previous session, Doorstop Theatre, my brain was on, what have they learned around co-creation? And does this add anything to our understanding of what co-creation is and isn't? What were the things that they did that created effective co-creation? So all the time, these questions have been underpinning the approach that we've taken. So I wanted to start here because it seemed like it was really important to kind of be clear about the context within which I was talking. And I'm trying, I suppose, personally, I'm trying to extract some learning for myself and to enhance my own toolkit, my own evaluation toolkit, from the learning that I can accrue from evaluating this network. And it seems to me that increasingly we're working with more complex projects. I'm certainly seeing, as an evaluator and as an independent consultant, I'm certainly seeing a lot more collaborative projects, a lot more collectives and consortia-based approaches to work, festivals that are multiple partnered. I know Hillary's in the room with us, the digital room, and director of the Happy Museum project. And Hillary's certainly worked on some hugely complex projects, particularly that one. So increasingly, I think we're looking at projects becoming more and more complex as we collaborate more and as we work more in I suppose, a less project-based way and a much more kind of holistic way. So complex projects then will always require from us different approaches to evaluating their impact. Existing methods, and if you like, the kind of more old-fashioned methods of project-based evaluation, are appropriate when you're looking at a very simple, straightforward intervention. This week, had this week been being evaluated as a distinct festival, then that would have been about containing the actual event. It's very distinct, it's very time-bound and participant-bound, I suppose, in terms of the numbers of participants and the ways in which people are interacting with the event. But if you place this event in the context of the whole co-creation network, it starts to feel much more complex. So our existing toolboxes in terms of our approaches to evaluation I think, have been rapidly expanding over the last 3 or 4 years as we've seen more complexity beginning to emerge in the projects and the programs of work that we were all engaging in. And that may also be around multiple funders as well, because where you have multiple funders for one distinct project, you may have different outcomes that have been agreed with those different funders, which again adds to the complexity because you're looking at a number of different dimensions in the same project. When a project makes a single change in a given context, this is the second bullet point, it's easier to actually draw inferences, draw conclusions about the effect of that intervention. You know, when we do this in a primary school with violins, with 8-year-olds, we can expect this particular kind of result, or we anticipate that result, we got it, and we know we got it because of certain strategies that we undertook. There's a very simple kind of causal relationship there between the intervention and the outcome. But when you're dealing with a complex project or a complex program of work with a number of different interventions, it ain't that simple. Because you've got, as we've said, a number of different activities, types of activities, they're happening. Similar activities might be happening in different contexts. A regional network, for example, within the Co-Creating Change network in the Southeast would probably be very, very different in terms of its impact and its outcomes to the impact and outcomes of a regional network in Wales or in the Northwest, because the contexts are very different. So dealing with that kind of combination of activities and contexts, there's a longer causal chain, if you like, between the intervention that you make and the outcome that you achieve at the end of that intervention, or as a result of that intervention, let's say, your desired outcomes. So it's very difficult when you're working with a complex project to understand the impact of a massive portfolio, if you like, a portfolio of activity. Or indeed across an organization. You know, I've been talking so far about complex programs of work, but what about when you start to look at a particular organization? We've just been joined by Sarah, welcome, from the old fire station in Oxford. Now, if we were to look at the overall activity of the old fire station in Oxford, my guess is it would be very, very complex. There'd be a massive range of different types of activity taking place within that organisation. And it actually it can be quite interesting to start to look at how you evaluate the big picture, the macro level of an organization, as opposed to the individual projects that might happen within that organization? How do the individual projects, or even the individual services within an organization, contribute to the outcomes that are achieved by the organization as a whole? You know, we have organizational business plans that are driven by a set of overarching aims, an overarching vision, mission. And all too often, we're evaluating the individual components of that, but not very often do we build those individual components back up into the macro level to actually work out how they've all contributed to the achievement of the whole, to the achievement of the organization as a whole entity. And so it could also be, this approach to evaluating complex projects can also be approached to individual organizations, from looking at the projects on the ground, that particular dance project in a primary school, the fundraising service that supports the whole organization, project in a hospital. All of those things will contribute to the bigger picture. And so, you know, in that context, it might be that the default mode might be to just evaluate the individual elements, but actually a more ambitious approach would be to align a kind of more complex overarching framework to the overall aims and objectives of the organization, a bit like we've been talking about with the Co-Creating Change Network. So I guess looking at, you know, this approach, how do we approach evaluating whether it's a complex project, whether it's an organizational approach? How can we approach it differently to the way that we might approach an individual project or an individual service area of an organization? What can we do? So it's moving from the micro to the macro, moving from the individual level to the higher level, and progressing up. And there's a quote there that comes from the original blog, I think, that I wrote about how we were going to approach evaluating the Co-Creating Change Network. And I said, we must work from the micro, the projects, to the macro level learning, which can be extrapolated from them. Practically, this requires an approach to evaluation that is open, honest, and brave. And I think we were very aware right from the beginning with the Co-Creating Change Network that this wasn't going to necessarily be easy, that in some senses it is easier to evaluate an individual project, but once you start to piece 6 projects together, or 11 commissions, for example, they're all contributing to a much bigger picture. And it's so important in that context to be open, to be honest, to be brave about what works and what doesn't work. And all too often in our sector, we're encouraged, perhaps passively, perhaps subliminally, we're encouraged to think about the success. And the reason we do that is perhaps a policy imperative, it's a funding imperative. We want to make sure that we're advocating for our work. So we talk about what works, we talk about what we did that was good, that worked, that was effective. We're not necessarily as open and as honest and as brave about talking about what didn't work and what we wouldn't do again and what we've learned to avoid, helping others perhaps to reinvent the wheel. So there is a degree of kind of change, I think, in perhaps our attitudes and the culture that we operate within, that requires us to be as open about what isn't working as what does work. And there's a wonderful project that some of you will, I know, have come across already, led by academics David Stevenson and Leila Yankovic, University of Leeds. And they led a project called the Fail Space Project. And Leila is going to be leading, thank you, the link's there in the chat for you. Leila is going to be leading a workshop on that for the Co-Creating Change Network at some point in the new year. And Tom will be in touch about that. But we've asked her specifically to lead a workshop on how you facilitate conversations around failure, because that's just as important in terms of our learning as talking about success. So creating that open, honest, brave culture around how we gather our learning together. We decided right at the beginning, and this again came through a couple of workshops that we ran at one of the Co-Creating Change Network events. I think it was in Leeds. But we ran a workshop with members of the network talking about how we would approach or could approach the evaluation. And these 5 bullet points that sit underneath came out of that. And I think they're relevant to something which is much, much, much wider than just the Co-Creating Change Network. How do you create spaces for reflection and learning so that you're looking at evaluation as a process of reflection, as a process of learning, rather than as something which is judgmental? And I think all too often, evaluation can be seen as something which is a judgment rather than something which is about learning. And I always remember Liz Morton saying to the commissions when we ran a workshop on evaluating the individual commissions, and Battersea Arts Centre, in the context of the Co-Creating Change Network, has been a funder. And I always remember Liz saying to those commissions, you're accountable to Battersea Arts Centre for your learning. That's it. Now, that is such a rare thing to hear from a funder, albeit a peer funder, that your accountability is for your learning. And I think it's really important to kind of hold on to that. How do you create spaces, safe spaces, for reflection and learning within organisations, across networks, within consortia, within collaborative projects, whatever? But how do you create that space? How do you build opportunities for consultation, testing, evaluation, learning, reflection into your planned activities so that it's not something which is seen as an add-on? It's not a kind of annex to the project, but is an integral part of it. So, for example, with the with the growth and replication commissions, as part of the Co-Creating Change Network, we ran a workshop right at the beginning with the commissions. We then ran a workshop halfway through with the cohort. There were then a series of one-to-one conversations to support the commissions, and we will be having a final roundtable conversation at the end. So they were built in at key stages to allow the cohort to share their learning with one another. So they didn't feel like an additional activity, I hope. They weren't designed to be an additional activity. They were designed to be key milestone points in the projects where the 5 commissions could share learning with one another. So it was formative as opposed to summative, which again, I think is an important principle in the context of evaluation. How do you create a context which is formative, which is iterative, which is interacting with a project and allowing for improvement rather than something which is done at the end? A teacher is not going to reach the end of a school year with a pupil and say, if only you'd learned to hold your pencil properly, you would have been a better writer. No, instead, the teacher is going to work with that child to make sure that their pencil skills are improved in an ongoing way. And that's the way that evaluation processes should help to interact with the project itself, and be iterative, interacting with it and helping to improve the quality of it and to improve the shape of it. So the third bullet point then that we hit on right at the beginning of the Co-Creating Change Network was about trying to develop mechanisms where we could support local learning, support the learning in at the macro level of project-based learning, with tools, with templates that could be used to support self-evaluation and reflection on the ground in situ. And those were always very light touch. We developed very light touch tools that I'll come back to slightly later in the presentation. And then looking at how we could build capacity through the way that we worked with the network. How could we develop, CPD sessions like this, or the workshops that we ran with the commissions and the cohorts, to actually just develop a kind of more confident approach to their learning and reflection. And the final point was that we wanted to have an ongoing way of sharing our learning through the development of case studies, through blogs, through telling stories as the Co-Creating Change Network evolved. So we've never approached the evaluation of this network as something which was going to end up with a great big thumping report at the end that would just sit and gather dust on somebody's desk. It was meant to be something which would interact with the programme of work. So the 3 conversations that were held last year around critics and writing about co-creation. The second one was about co-creating in a digital world. And then the third one was about the implications of our learning for funders. So those conversations were about telling stories. They were about interacting and sharing the learning in an ongoing way. And all of that, all of those tactics, if you like, could be applied beyond this network into an organisation or into a festival or into a collaborative project that you might be working on with 3 or 4 different partners. They weren't just tactics, I think, that applied to the Co-Creating Change Network. And they are tactics that I've applied and continue to apply in lots of other evaluation projects that I've been working on since and over the same period. This next diagram, which possibly is hard for you to see, just basically outlines that kind of micro to macro approach, if you like, where it's starting up here at the top. I don't know whether you can see that at all. It's starting at the top with what is termed baseline. You know, what are the expectations of all of the stakeholders to a particular project? What are the starting points for each of the impact dimensions that you're trying to achieve? And then it comes to the second. Thanks, Jay. I'm glad some of you can read it. You can actually click in the right-hand corner and go to full screen, I think, if that would help. The second stage, just coming down the arrow to where it starts to widen out, is looking at how you evaluate individual projects within the programme or ongoing projects like the growth commissions or like the dance projects within an organisation. And then the third set of text there is talking about extrapolating macro level learning at the end of an agreed period, which could be, you know, the end of a festival. It could be at the end of a period when all of the growth commissions are finished in January. We pull together that macro level learning at that point. And all of that then is formative and informs the way that you support the project or the programme as it continues to evolve and continues to develop. And then the final point at the bottom could be, not always, because not all projects have a finite end. You know, the Co-Creating Change Network will end in its current funded form in March of next year, but that's not to say that the network may not continue beyond it. So when we talk about a final evaluation report, in a way, it's a kind of bit of a red herring, really, because, you know, not all projects do have that definitive end. They're not all time determined, if that makes sense. But if you are producing some kind of summative evaluation at the end of an agreed period, at the end of a funded programme of work or whatever, then it's about, you know, were your questions answered? Will we be able in March to answer those 3 questions that I framed at the beginning of the presentation? Will we be any more clear on what co-creation is and what it isn't, and what it needs and what its outcomes are? I think we will be, but, you know, who knows? So that's by kind of a way of, I suppose, visualizing how you might move from your starting point through the micro projects to a more macro vision or understanding of what you've actually achieved. Applying this beyond a project or a programme of work to an organisation, which I've been talking about, can be depicted in this kind of way. You're trying all the time, or you would be trying all the time when you work at an organisation-wide level to go from project to the organisation as a whole. You would be trying to align with the business plan, with the overall aims and outcomes of the organisation as a whole. So you'd be developing or trying to develop an overarching high-level framework that would then be supported by individual projects or services and functions. So they might have their own mini evaluation frameworks, and then all of these things stack up together to contribute to how the organisation achieves its high-level objectives. So you're generating high-level learning and evidence of organisational impact through the evidence of project-based or service-level functions, the evaluation of those service-level functions. So again, it's the same kind of process, moving from the ground to a higher level approach. And it's, you know, it's not rocket science. It actually can be done quite simply. Well, I'm saying quite simply, not necessarily simply, but it can be done in a way which actually can work. So let's look at this. The stages in evaluation. This is, you know, I'm kind of teaching some of you, I know I'm presenting like grandmother sucking eggs, that these stages will be self-explanatory to most of you. But I do sometimes think that we forget the first one a lot of the time. I'm approached a lot to support evaluation when projects have already been planned and are already plotted out, resources are allocated, budgets are allocated, even artists commissioned to deliver them. And there's no evaluation framework in place. And I think that's kind of missing a trick, because I think if you are to start with planning your evaluation before you start the project, then you're actually making sure that the design of the project that you're putting in place will actually allow you to learn what you want to learn from it. So you're not making any kind of assumptions that activity that applied 2 years ago in a particular context might still be relevant. You're really checking all of that right at the beginning of a project, with the design of a project. Determining right at the beginning the change that you want to achieve, your aims, your objectives, the aspired for outcomes that you want from a project, and designing that at the point of project design, even at the point of fundraising for a project, knowing what it is that you're actually trying to achieve and planning the evaluation process at the beginning in the planning stages to address those things. And that will allow you to embed an evaluation process into the project itself, so that it doesn't feel like an add-on, something that is sort of an adjunct at a much later stage. You know, that, oh shit, we've forgotten about evaluation thing, that I'm sure we've all experienced at different points. And certainly as a consultant, I have been approached to evaluate projects that are already finished. You know, where people have kind of gone, oh God, we didn't commission an evaluation, or we didn't do it. We're missing tricks, you know, because if we build it in, it starts to contribute to quality improvement. It starts to contribute to the way the project shapes and evolves. And, you know, conversations happen and changes happen, and it can be so exciting. So really thinking about how you embed an evaluation process from the point of project design, right from the very beginning, and actually making sure that even before you've started the project, you're thinking about how you might evaluate your learning. And then the second box is the during, you know, the way you collect your data. It's how you gather evidence, how you record activity. It's how you monitor and use that learning regularly to inform project development in a formative way to improve it, and how you reflect that in any changes that you might make to the programme of work. So it's the before, the during, and then at the end of the project, where you might evaluate your outcomes, you're evaluating your impact, and you're trying to disseminate your learning more widely. And that, again, is a trick, I think, that is often missed in evaluation. You know, bluntly, we work in a competitive environment, don't we? Because we're all looking for funding. And so we often tend to keep our knowledge to ourselves. We feel that, you know, I don't know, we designed that project, we want it to continue, we keep it to ourselves, we don't share it. And actually, what that leads to is constant reinvention of wheels. it leads to projects that are, you know, a similar project being developed in Dorset to a one that was developed in rural Scotland, for example. And yet the learning from one could have informed the design and the development of the other. So I'm really passionate about how we share learning from evaluation processes and how that benefits a wider sector. And I always encourage clients that I'm working with to think not just about how their evaluation work will benefit them, but how their evaluation work will benefit the wider sector. What might it have to offer the rest of the sector, and how can they share that and disseminate it, whether it's through a website, whether it's conference papers, whether it's articles. But yeah, it's kind of, yeah, how do you share that learning? So I think just looking at evaluation in terms of those quite simple stages can help us to avoid some of the pitfalls. Nick's just posted in the chat, planning the project in its entirety. Missing a trick seems an understatement when designing evaluation afterwards. Absolutely, you know, it is an understatement, but it is one that I think often does happen. This next template is one that we've been using as part of the Co-Creating Change Network, and it's a pretty recognizable logic model, a version of a logic model that does seem to work quite effectively and might be useful to you as a tool. It's worth maybe, I don't know, printing that off, or if we can share it maybe with people who are attending at a later stage. The first column in it is actually, again, something that I think we often take for granted in our sector. In research terms, there's the notion of the hypothesis, which is the kind of the assumption, I suppose, that you're trying to test. Any scientific experiment will have a hypothesis. Any PhD will have a hypothesis. And actually, arguably, any project that we design in the cultural sector will also have an underpinning assumption. You know, we believe that if we design a dance project to work in hospitals with people with dementia, that it will improve their sense of well-being. You know, so those kind of assumptions will always sit there beneath the design of any project that we implement or any program of work that we implement. But making them explicit at the beginning in project design is actually a useful exercise, because that takes you to the next column, which is, if that's your assumption, what is it that you're trying to learn? Taking the dementia example, you're trying to learn what strategies might work and be most effective in enhancing well-being, working with people with dementia. You might be asking what strategies are less effective. You might be asking how best can you involve carers or partners of people living with dementia. So what are your inquiry questions? What is it that you're trying to learn? The next column is what you want to achieve. So these two things interconnect. You know, what is it that you want to achieve? Enhanced well-being is one of those in that particular example. The context, what are the external factors that are impacting on a particular project? The next column is about being explicit again about the inputs that you've got, the resources that you've got to bring. And then the next column is around the mechanisms, the activities and the processes. Do you have the resources to achieve those activities and those processes? Will those activities and processes that you're designing, 10-week series of workshops or whatever, allow you to test your hypothesis? Will it allow you to answer some of your inquiry questions? And if not, how can you change that, given the clarity that you've got on what your resources are? So these columns are all kind of, I suppose, moving. It looks very linear, but it's not necessarily a linear process, because you might come to looking at the activities and think, no, these are not the right activities to test these assumptions or to achieve those aims. We need different kinds of activities. So they might interact and move around between one another. The next column is pretty self-explanatory. It's the participants, the partners, the who is taking part in it. Have they got different expectations? Are they looking for different things? What will their experience? What experiences are they bringing into the project or the program of work? The next column is outputs, and these are your tangible, the tangible results of the program of work. What outputs? 11 growth commissions is a good example of that, or 10 two-hour workshops is a good example of that. They tend to be quantitative, they're tangible, they're numerical. 1 publication, 3 podcasts, 2 conference presentations, 60 people attending. They're the outputs. The next one is the outcomes, and the outcomes are the less tangible things, the changes that you want to achieve. In the case of the dementia workshops, the well-being. How do you make a difference to the people who are taking part in the project? What are the changes that you're going to achieve? And then the final column in this particular template is looking at what methods you might use to collect data, to collect evidence that might allow you to evidence that you've achieved those outputs and those outcomes. So things like registers of attendance, numbers of people attending, website statistics will help you with your outputs, because they'll provide the evidence of the numerical, of the quantitative outputs that you've achieved. Whereas your outcomes are going to require much more qualitative measures, things like case studies, like interviews, like focus groups. So the kind of the measures that tell stories, the measures that actually are much more narrative based and much more what used to be called soft. We used to have this thing about hard and soft evidence. And I guess the hard evidence is often the numbers, the outputs, whereas the soft evidence is often the qualitative, the stories, the narratives, and the kind of the textural. It adds texture. You know, if you say in an evaluation, you know, if you're using mainly quantitative data and you're being very dependent on outputs, and something like, I don't know, the music hubs, for example, the music education hubs are very output driven because they are primarily funded by the Department for Education, who are interested in how many children take part. So they tend to be very output driven. But actually, you know, saying that 90% of children who started at the end of a school year to learn to play an instrument are continuing at the end of the school year, actually, so what? Why did they continue? What was it that kept them engaged? And that's where the outcomes, where the narrative and the texture starts to come into play. So these two things need to sit together. The numbers and the stories need to sit together for it to be rich, for it to have any kind of meaning. So yes, holistic approaches to evaluations being posted in the conversation. Absolutely. These two things are not, it's not an either or. They have to sit together for it to be meaningful and for it to really enhance our learning and enhance our knowledge of what we're doing. So just moving on, one of the things that has happened over the last couple of weeks, actually, and I'm sure most of you will have come across this, the Centre for Cultural Value, based at the University of Leeds, which has been co-funded by Arts Council England, by the Paul Hamlyn Foundation, and by the Arts and Humanities Research Council, has been looking at co-creating what they call a set of evaluation principles. And it's interesting that the three funders behind it are actually sitting there funding this programme of work. And I hope that these evaluation principles will start to affect the way in which many funders are actually requiring their fundees to report, because they feel really lovely to me somehow. There are 12 principles that are grouped under 4 headings, and the links that have been reported, that have been posted in the conversation in the chat, will take you directly to the links and to much more detail. This is just a screen grab of their summary slide. But the four main headings under which the principles are gathered are that they are beneficial. In other words, they're going to be useful, whether it's to you, whether it's to the wider sector, whether it's, and how can they be applied? Are they going to help? Are they going to be useful? And there is so much evaluation that actually is not terribly useful, that is done for advocacy purposes or other reasons and is not used, So how can they be beneficial, and who are they beneficial to? The second major heading is that they're robust. So they should be rigorous. Your evaluation should be rigorous, should be open-minded, and proportionate. There's no point having a massive evaluation process for a tiny little project. It's got to be proportionate to the scale of the programme of work. They need to be people-centred. And this, I think, for me, is hugely important, because this is where the ethics of any form of evaluation sits. Are they many-voiced? I like to think of evaluation as being in multiple voices. How do you bring the voice of a teacher, a pupil, and a parent together in order to assess impact on individual children, for example, in a schools-based project? How do you look at the evaluation through different lenses? And how can they be engaged? How can you involve participants in the evaluation so that it's not done to them, but with them? And doing to, as opposed to doing with, it is something that I think is a really important way to look at it. To what extent are you developing your evaluation with the people that you're working with? And we tried to do that with the Co-Creating Change Network through a series of workshops right at the onset, and then through tweaking the approaches that we were taking to the commissions. The fourth overarching principle that the Centre for Cultural Values come up with is that they're connected. In other words, they're shared, they're transparent, so people understand them, and they're not something, the evaluation isn't something that is just kind of hidden or being done behind a closed door, but is something that is very open and honest and encourages openness and transparency. So I think these principles are actually, they're moving towards, pointing towards a holistic approach. They're pointing towards the kind of stitching together of, output-based approaches that some funders require, and outcomes-based approaches that are much more meaningful and much more helpful to our organisation and sector-based learning. In terms of co-creating evaluation, I guess, there are different tactics and different approaches that can be taken to this. And Mark Robinson has actually done some really interesting work on how you co-create an evaluation framework. And that's, again, there's a link to that, I think, that Claudia can maybe post up. It'll come up in the end of this presentation in the final slide. But Mark's done some really detailed work on how to co-create evaluation. And I think these are the kind of key underpinning questions behind a co-created approach to evaluation. Who is it that you're evaluating for? Is it you as an organisation? Is it the sector? Is it the beneficiaries themselves? Is it the collaborators, the artistic collaborators? And if you're evaluating for any or all of these, how do you involve those people in the process of design? How do you actually engage people in designing an approach to evaluation that feels meaningful and relevant and useful, beneficial to them? And what's the purpose of it is a further question to ask at the onset. Is the purpose about learning, or is the purpose about reporting? And we were very clear with the approach to the Co-Creating Change Network that the purpose was about learning, that any reporting would come out of the learning. It wasn't cart before horse, so to speak. Let's generate the learning, and then we can use what we've learned to report. And that feels like the right order. The third question that seems crucial to me in terms of design is who should be involved in it. And I've referred to this, but who should be involved at key points to shape, to learn from it? So, how do you review things? working on a range of different projects at the minute, and I always build in review periods where we go back to the framework and say, what should we be tweaking? Have we learned enough about that particular inquiry question? Are there other questions that have emerged that we want to focus on now in year 2 or in year 3? So how do you kind of involve people at key points to make sure that it's still alive, that it's not, kind of become stale or lost? And then the inquiry questions, what questions do you all want to answer? In a project in a school, for example, what do the teachers want to learn? Never mind what you as the cultural sector provider want to learn. What do they want to learn? And how can the framework enable you to gather that so that you can answer everybody's questions? But balancing that with the notion of proportionality, how can you be focused as well and not try to do too much? So they're kind of some overarching questions to ask of yourself. And the link is now there in the chat to Mark Robinson's How to Co-Create an Evaluation that does address some of these questions alongside lots of others in a kind of step-by-step approach to co-creating. So I'm not going to try and replicate that in this workshop. The resource is there and it's a brilliant one. So just a final kind of check back in terms of co-creating change in the network. There were 11 project commissions, as I referred to earlier on in the process. And just to illustrate this whole approach I've been talking about in relation to those 11 commissions, we designed a very simple framework which used the logic model tool that we looked at earlier in the presentation. We took that very simple framework, we took the arrow design, we looked at all of that in a workshop with the commissions at the very beginning of the process, which was between September and January of 2020. So we ran 3 workshops with the 3 different cohorts, and all 11 projects attended one of those workshops. As a result of that workshop, each of the projects, the commissions, developed their own framework and were very clear about what they were trying to learn from their particular commission. And the accountability back to Battersea Arts Centre was very clearly around the learning and around what they learned and how that learning could be shared with the wider co-creating change network. So we produced or have produced 11 summative case studies that have been written in a similar format. So that was the other tool that the commissions were provided with, along with the framework, was a kind of template for a case study with a similar set of headings and, kind of probes sitting underneath those headings. And those case studies will be published on the Co-Creating Change Network as a suite of case studies with a blog written by myself that tries to extrapolate. It's Friday afternoon and I'm losing the ability to string a word together, never mind a sentence. But with a blog that tries to extrapolate the macro level learning from across the 11 projects. And they'll be published soon, certainly before Christmas. So that kind of journey, if you like, from designing a very simple framework, the tool for which we've provided you with, to writing up a case study at the end, drawing on all of the data that's been gathered and answering the key questions that each project set out to answer, and then publishing that along with some macro level learning that draws out some top level stuff from all 11 projects. That is, I think, an example of the process in action and how we've transferred that into the network and into one of the activity strands of the Co-Creating Change network. This is the final slide, is literally the links that we've already posted, I think, in the conversation for you. The Fail Space project there at the top, the co-creation one from Mark Robinson, the second one. The CERA Alliance is actually a really interesting set of tools and resources that you might want to dip into. The cultural value principles, And the final one there, the local trust, the Evaluating the Creative Civic Change programme. They've published some fantastic tools and some amazing resources, and have a very interesting approach, again, to evaluating a hugely complex set of networks, but building from the grassroots, from the bottom up again, moving from the micro to the macro, the same kind of principles that I've been outlining in this presentation. So that's the end of my presentation. So I'm going to stop sharing the slides, just because they're probably going to be a bit of a distraction. And if you have any questions or any comments to make, please post them either in, well, just stick with the chat, because I don't think there's huge numbers of us here. So we could probably just stick with the chat. The Q, you can post a question in the Q&A if you want to, but if you just want to stick in the chat, then please feel free to do that. So yeah, I mean, I'm probably more interested than in comments and feedback, in terms of, you know, your thoughts, your reactions, as I am in any questions, because, you know, sometimes, well, I may be able to answer your questions and I may not be able to. So over to you. Let's see if there's anything that anybody would like to contribute. There's a couple of points that have come up about holistic, reinforcing the holistic approach, the false dichotomy between outputs and outcomes that I've referred to as we've been going through the presentation. So I think I have been cross-referencing a lot of the comments. Hilary Jennings has just posted, often the best learning comes from repeating a process, tweaking it based on learning from the previous iteration. Will CCC get another go? Is a good question, Hilary. I think it's an interesting one, which I'll pass to Sarah in a second. But I think the beginning of your post there, the best learning coming from repeating a process, tweaking it based on learning from the previous iteration, is a really, really interesting one. And I think it came across very clearly if anybody attended the Rent Party presentation, the Moving Roots presentation on Tuesday afternoon, I think. And there was something really interesting there about how the touring of that piece of theatre, the touring of that concept, how they built on the shoulders of the previous iteration. So the learning from the initial work in Medway, and then moving it to I've forgotten the order now, Wales, Peterborough, and then to the final one in Wigan. Each iteration of that particular piece of work built on the previous iteration and built on the learning from the previous iteration. And I think that's absolutely bang on, you know, that you the same process can be built on over and over again, you know, and improved. And I think the second part of that question is one I'd like to pass to you, Sarah. You know, will CCC get another go? It's a kind of big question.
Okay, I'm just going to say what I was trying to type. It feels the big thing that's come up all week is to do less better. And I can think of so many pieces of work, including the Co-Creating Change Network, where people do think about evaluation at the beginning, quite often do, and come up with a set of questions. And it's very easy in delivery to forget about it and then come back to it. And it always feels like the more time we've got for embedded approaches feel better, and often organizations and artists are so stretched that often evaluation, it might be the thing people do think about at the top end of a project, but then it gets lost along the wayside. But it's very hard to do less better when we're doing this sort of work, which always feels really urgent. So it's that seesaw of managing that.
Yeah.
It's a huge question about the Co-Creating Change Network. One of the questions I posed at the very start of the week was if we knew what we knew now 4 years ago, and by that I sort of mean the state of the world. I don't think we could have imagined what would have happened. David Jubb, who I think is a radical person, wrote quite a radical blog about why he thought the Co-Creating Change Network was an amazing thing to do. And when you read that blog now, it just doesn't feel quite urgent enough, because nobody knew what was coming. And I don't think, and of course we still don't know what's coming, but it doesn't feel like it's going to get slower. So my sense is there is still a need and an urgency for this work. Whether this iteration is the best way to do it, I think having a network of over 100 members is really hard to feel like you're part of a network. I think that the commissions that we've been able to give out have been really valuable, both of them, the smaller grassroots ones and the larger ones. And for many of the sessions that we've seen this week, there is a lot of fantastic work going out, and how do we grow and replicate those? And there's a particular issue there because people's capacity has never been less. So I think there's a huge amount to think about on a very practical term. Last week, we didn't know whether Rent Party was going to be able to happen because there are no technicians in London. That's sort of not too much of an exaggeration. And so the workforce has been decimated by the last 18 months. So I think a regrouping of what the Co-Creating Change Network could be and should be, I think a stock take of where we are and what people need, and looking at the learning that's taken place. And my thoughts would be the network would need to look very different. And actually, what is it that people need?
Yeah. Thanks for that, Sarah. I think that's a really you've captured so many different things in that. And Hillary's made a point about the kind of iteration side of things, how frustrating it can be because funders often want to fund something new and not a developed iteration. You know, it's kind of, okay, well, you've done that. What else are you going to do? What new stuff are you going to do now? And it'll be quite interesting because the session that follows this one, wraps up this week, is actually... sorry, me again, but only asking questions this time. I'm talking to Andy Curtis from the Paul Hamlyn Foundation. And I think this is one of the questions that will be quite interesting to fire at him actually this afternoon in conversation. You know, how do we work with funders? And I think Ines has posted something in the Q&A. If translating this learning to policymakers, for example, how do you find ways to share the emotive sides of these experiences with those decision makers? And I think that's a great question. But I actually think, so I think that my personal experience of working with funders is that more and more of them are actually more open to what you've termed the emotive sides of these experiences. I think that increasingly funders have become aware of the need to look at that mixed, holistic approach that isn't just output-based. I mean, I used the music education hubs as an example of one of the very extreme output-based funded projects. I mean, there are 120 music hubs in England, and the evaluation processes that they are subject to are purely output-based. There's very little which is outcome-based or qualitative. And that's largely because it's a government department accountable for government funding to the Treasury. But increasingly, I think funders like the Paul Hamlyn Foundation, like Calouste Gulbenkian, are actually, much more open to to a mixed method approach to evaluation, and not even just open, but wanting it. They want the qualitative. And I think that came across in the conversation the Co-Creating Change Network had with funders, where one of the questions was, how do we support co-created work better? And one of the answers to that is slightly different approaches to reporting and evaluation that are outcome-based and not output-based. Because if you're genuinely co-creating, you can't be output-based. You can't say it will be a theatre production or it will be a film. It might end up being a yoga retreat, as Curious Monkey discovered with their commission when they genuinely co-created with a group of asylum seekers. So funders, I think, are increasingly accepting the outcome-based approach and the importance of that.
I think that's entirely true. And I think sometimes funders get a bit of a hard time and they're a bit of an easy poke. I, with my other hat on, just made a really large application to Arts Council for a co-created piece of work that's taking place in Coventry around food poverty. Ooh. And I clearly said to them that I couldn't say what the budget would be spent on because we didn't know what the final output would be.
Sarah, I've lost you.
Ah, I'm still here. Can anyone else hear me? Yeah. And we got the money, which was a really great thing. But I think what is significant, and I think what we saw in the network, is that Battersea inadvertently became a funder, and we were able to give pots of money to smaller grassroots organisations that probably wouldn't have been able to make an application to Paul Hamlin, or if they had, it might have been lost in the amount of applications they have. So I think something I'm interested in is how can maybe larger organisations hold pots of money that they can give to smaller arts organisations or artists, because they hold those relationships.
Sarah, I can't hear you. I don't know whether everybody else can, but I've lost your volume completely.
Maybe.
I'm going to leave and come back in.
Okay. Oh God, I'm holding the fort. This is probably where I overshare. Yeah, I think my sense, one of the great things that the Co-Creating Change Network has done has been able to give out smaller pots of money to smaller arts organisations who maybe don't have those massive systems that large funders want in place. And I think seeing some of the sessions that we've seen this week, we can see that I don't really like the word grassroots organisations, but smaller organisations who are really community embedded are doing incredible work, and it is co-created and it's having massive outcomes and impacts. And so I think a responsibility for larger organisations such as BAC or other NPOs maybe could be a place to hold that money and develop those relationships. Has anyone got a question? Thank you. I'm just going to read this out from Inez. Real current point, Sarah. That's also something we've done at Changing the Story. We're a research grant program at Leeds. I think this almost subcontracting of funders to organisations is a great idea, so long as there's capacity. Yeah, I really agree. And one of the things that we are considering with the Co-Creating Change Network is to devolve the network with more regional leads, and seeing if those regional leads could hold those pots of money, those commissioning pots of money, and advocate for the practice in their regions. So it's just a conversation with the funders now. Oh, I've got the power. That's always dangerous. And Susanne is amazing. So Susanne, thank you so much in your absence for holding, as always, a brilliant session. And I'm going to thank her while she's not here, because she's been a really good critical friend to me this year. And I've really appreciated her support.